Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and in today's lesson, we're going to be just doing something we haven't done in a while, which is a topical lesson, which is distinct from our customary format, which is what is known as an expository formula. So there's two types of sermons you can listen to, and first off, this isn't strictly speaking a sermon, but it is a monologue. Formulas one can follow: an expository, which does it in a more or less linear progression. It comments on or elaborates, whatever you want to call it, on a single verse in the order in which they appear, and occasionally the preacher or teacher will connect it to other issues of life and scripture itself. And then the topical kind of hops around, and the subject we decided to talk about is the promise and the potential of Christian suffering. So we are all but virtually guaranteed to be persecuted, and this is the price we pay. So I want you to know what you're getting into when you sign up to be a Christian. The price we pay is persecution. That is a promise if we are walking faithfully, that is. So I think persecution is one of the last things, that and sin and hell, that you'll ever hear preached by a prosperity gospel heretic. But persecution is part of the calling, but there's also potential in it. And as we will read and elaborate on, and we'll explain why as we elaborate, the reward is eternal, but the pain is temporary and temporal. So we have to sacrifice the temporal in order to lay hold of the heavenly. So it's necessary and proper for us to be persecuted, because without it we could not grow into sanctified creatures, and we mimic the master. So as disciples we are called to suffer. And now persecution is nothing unique to the Judeo-Christian culture. It's something that's a fact of life and history. But in the Jewish people were oppressed, in the Old Testament Jews, that is, they were oppressed and persecuted by foreigners. The rich among them constantly abused and exploited the poor, the vulnerable, in violation of the Mosaic law, and they had a terrible habit of stoning the prophets who Yahweh had sent into their midst, and that's going to touch on that. But we just want to establish the fact that every single verse we've selected in our topical formula comes from the New Testament. So with the as Judaism evolves into Christianity, persecution has a new meaning and a new perspective, and that's what we want to elaborate on here. Opening verse we're going to do is first. We just got to turn there. 1 Peter 4, 10, 12 through 13. Sorry for the delay. Beloved ones, do not be surprised at the fiery trials that is coming upon you, to try you, as though some unusual manner has befallen you. So Peter is addressing an assembly the persecution was an established fact of life for the early Christians, and is with us still. In 21st century America, our degrees of persecution are far more benign, but we still have to bear some persecution, and we'll touch on that as we elaborate later. We just want to concentrate on the passage itself now. So he's saying, think it not strange in other translations. So nothing unusual that you are being persecuted or tried, or and this is because it is part of the calling. It is what we sign up for. It is what makes us Christians, and without persecution we cannot call ourselves Christians. We're going to elaborate on that thought more fully as the discourse develops. But as you share Messiah's sufferings, rejoice, in order that you might rejoice exultingly at the revelation of his esteem. So there's actually a lot to digest here. One, when we suffer with the Messiah, he suffers with us. He enters into our pains. He comforts us. There is nothing we can go through that he has not already gone through himself. He paved the way and made the path. And if suffering was part of his calling, it must be the disciples too, because the disciple-master relationship is defined by a mimicking of the model that the master provides. And but we can enter into the revelation of his esteem, that is heaven, that is salvation, that is the blessed expectation, without which persecution. So the way to heaven is paved by persecution. Next passage is Philippians 1:29, which reads, "Because to you it has been given a grace on behalf of Messiah, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sakes." So the believing and the suffering are not presented as an either or formula. It's not only but also formula verbally. So we don't have the option. Believing is our belief will be tested by the persecutions and hopefully refined. So it's not enough to believe if you are a fair weather believer when you just believe when it's neutral or passive, or the going hasn't gotten tough yet. When that faith is tested and it's not willing to suffer for the message he knows that they know is true, then they're no longer Christians. It's seriously that simple. Next passage, 2 Timothy 3:12. This is Paul writing to his pastoral protege Timothy, who was, among other things, taken advantage of because he was younger than most of the people he ministered to. "And indeed, all those wanting to live reverently in Messiah Yahshua shall be persecuted." So this is the price we pay for walking in righteousness. Often the world thinks that people suffer because they are sinful, and sin is related to suffering. But when we are Christians, we must not only keep ourselves sinless and walk in righteousness, but also bear the reproach for belonging to the righteous one, because they're not against us, they're against the master. It's really all about him. We are co-sufferers, and we partake in the fellowship of the suffering. We're going to touch on that in a later passage. Next one, John 15:20, which reads, "Remember the word that I sent to you. A servant is not greater than his master. And if they persecuted me, they shall persecute you too. If they have kept my word, they would have kept yours too." So there's basically three levels to interpret here. We're going to focus on the middle one. If they persecuted me, they shall persecute you too. This is the master addressing the disciples in the farewell discourse. These are his final parting instructions to the disciples, and John alone was privy to these John alone recorded the contents of these conversations. But if we follow him and mimic him and call ourselves his disciples, that means we have to bear the stigma and approach. So it's not only enough to live by the principles, we have to pay a price for living by those principles. So if it happened to him, we have no right reason or righteous expectation to expect it to not happen to us. But of course, his suffering puts all ours in trivial lights, but it's just a price we have to pay in whatever way we can. Now, persecution may not be a threat to 21st century America, but that belittles the broader picture of the globe, because Christians are getting killed in Nigeria and all over the place in the world. It is not a safe place to be a Christian in the 21st century, however safe we are in America. But we still have to bear the reproach. There's a lot of hostility in academia against us, and the culture is completely against us. But that's, these are the enemies of our warfare. And as we eventually read, we'll touch on towards the end, is we are to love and bless those who persecute us. That's part of the formula. And now we're going to turn to Philippians 3:6, and then we're going to do verse 10. So this is Paul speaking to the assembly at Philippi. "According to ardor, persecuting the assembly, according to righteousness that is in the law, having become blameless." So Paul admits, reviewing his history of his Jewish pedigree, he admits that he was a persecutor of the faith he now embraced. So he was the exemplary disciple of the master, and he was once hostile and violently against him. So he who was a partaker and very much a progenitor in the systematic persecutions of Christians, he ended up paying his fair share of price, and in that he had perspective. We also read in his conversion experience in Acts 9:16 or 17 thereabouts, that he will be called, I must show him while he has been called to suffer for my name. So Paul did reap what he had sown in persecuting. Whatever he inflicted would return on him several times over. So he did have a qualified expertise that his past ought not to diminish him as an authority of persecution just because he was the agent of something he no longer was and didn't die as, and that doesn't define his life because he more than made up for it. But in the 10th verse of the same chapter, we read, "To know him in the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death." So the fellowship of the suffering, when he enters into our pains, and we are to theoretically, or at least empathetically, enter not only to our own pains, but those of our brethren and those who are sick and suffering in the world, who have no idea that who God is and how he can heal them. So we are all part, humanity ought to at least empathetically enter into all of our sufferings and not be so self-focused on our own personal pleasure and immediate gratification. Christians are called to transcend the ethos of the world, which is geared towards self, and persecution is the opposite of selfishness, because we're doing it for someone greater than ourselves, and we are the ones who benefit, but we're doing it to repay, however infinitesimally we can, the one whose blood was shed on the cross and who paid the precious price of our salvation. And Romans 3 verses 4... Chapter 5, verses 3 and 4. This is Paul speaking once more. "And not only this, but we also exult in persecutions, knowing that persecution works endurance, and endurance approvedness, and approvedness hope." So the chain which begins in embracing and rejoicing in the fact of one's suffering is that when we are willing to endure it for a sake greater than ourselves and for someone who is greater than ourselves, then we will rejoice in the fact that we are counted worthy to suffer in his name. We read of that in Acts 5:41. That's one of the ones I didn't include on the topical formula, but it does spring to mind. We can never exhaust the whole subject in a less than 30-minute time frame. Anyways, so endurance. Without endurance, we cannot overcome our trials. So our trials can overcome us. The persecution can overcome us, and there comes a breaking point at which anyone is willing to endure. But we are called to endure nonetheless, and if we endure, we will be approvedness. We will earn it from heaven and divinity, and that is the foundation of our hope, which is eternal salvation and fellowship with the one who made us. 2 Corinthians 1:6-7. "And if we suffer persecution, it is for your comfort and salvation, being worked out and enduring the same sufferings which we also suffer. If we are comforted, it is for your comfort and salvation." So Paul's entire mindset is revolving around others. He knows that he's saved, and anyone who lives to tell the tale as he did lives to tell the tale. So that's what he's all about. He's all about bringing the joy of salvation that he had come to know because he had made himself known to him. So from that, he was willing to suffer, and he was grateful. And when he suffered, just on the fact that the good news has spread, we read somewhere in Philippians 1. But it was all for a sake. It was for their sakes, and ultimately it was implicitly for the master's sake. And salvation was the motivating factor underneath it all. So everything we personally endure being persecuted, that contributes, or I don't want to say it it's just a mark of our calling. Why don't we leave it at that? 7th verse. "And our hope for you is steadfast, because we know that as you are sharing in the sufferings, so also in the comfort." So there is comfort in suffering. We are when we mourn, we are comforted, and that's one of the paradoxes of the Beatitudes. But suffering and comfort are presented almost equally. So Paul democratizes these two otherwise mutually antagonistic forces, but he's of the same mindset. He was willing to, he could be abased and abound, and his joy was unshakable, and his hope was enduring. So he was, not only was he enduring physically, and he bore 39 lashes and a host of other things we read in this sixth chapter of the same book. We're not going to cover that one. But, it was all for salvation, his own and others. So the purpose of persecution is greater than ourselves. We just want to bear it in perspective whenever it comes our way, and however, what formula it comes in, or to what degree. And Matthew 5:12, this is, from the Beat 10 through 12, beginning with the 10th. Blessed are those who persecuted for righteousness' sakes, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So the investment we make when we pay the price of persecution is beyond us in heaven. It is transcendent. And even though we are blessed for persecuted, eventually we're going to read, we are to bless those who persecute us. Blessed are you when they reproach and persecute you, and falsely say every wicked word against you, for my name's sake. So the key and controlling element is my name's sakes. When we are persecuted for no greater reason than we are jerks, then we are not really persecuted for his name's sake. And we will know the difference when we are not so wrapped up in ourselves that we consider personal slights to be suffering for his name's sake. That's exactly the type of mentality I want to encourage people to stay as far away from as possible. But rejoice and be glad, because your reward is in the heaven is great. For in this way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So the Old Testament, and remember, we don't comment on the Old Testament at all, at least verse by verse, but the apostles were the effective functional equivalent of the prophets of the Old Testament, the New Testament apostles. So if the prophets were virtually guaranteed persecution, they, as their heirs and the main movers of the New Testament, would have no right or reason or righteous expectation to expect anything different. Most of the prophets paid for their prophecies with their lives, or a lot of them did. But they were all persecuted in one way or another, and the severity of which really pales in comparison to that which we in 21st century America could possibly know. But then we read something even more counterintuitive in the tail end of this chapter, beginning in verse 43. You heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, nowhere was this said in the Old Testament. This was a saying of circulation. This is of the world saying. This isn't scriptural. We're told to love our friends and families and hate our enemies, but the Messiah tells them something the exact opposite of which you read of in the 44th verse. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those cursing you, do good to those hating, and pray for those insulting and persecuting you. So we are to bless those who curse us. The only way we can emerge triumphant in the cosmic struggle which wages in us and around us of good and evil is to overcome hatred with love and darkness with light. And there's only one way to do that. That is to treating our enemies as indiscriminately as the Father does the righteous and the wicked. We're just going to read the 45th verse. So that you become sons of your Father in the heaven, because he makes his sun rise on the wicked and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. So if he is so indiscriminate with his blessings, he makes the sun shine for those who disrespect him, acknowledge him not, have cursed him, would curse him to his face. He still makes the sun shine. So if we are to be children of our Father, we cannot expect to be any different in our and be any more discriminatory in those we bless and those we curse. We are to be friends friendly with all, even though not friends with all, but to always try and win the enemy over to our side through forgiveness and reconciliation. And then Luke, we read of Luke's version in the slightly similar, his version of the Sermon on the Mount, which is not as extensive as Matthew's, but the 6th, 27th, and 29th verse. But I say to you who are hearing, love your enemies, do good to those hating you, bless those cursing you, and pray for those insulting you. And to him who hits you on the one cheek, offer the other also. And from him who takes away your outer garment, do not withhold the inner garment either. So he's advocating a literal extreme in enduring the insults and the pains and the persecutions that our enemies might want to inflict on us. We are to give them more than they ask for. And this taxes the natural man's finite capacities to reflect the divine model, but he could have summoned 10,000 angels, a legion of 10,000 angels to rescue him from the cross, but he didn't do that. He took it, and he took it all for us, and it was a willing sacrifice. He had the entire cosmos at the hands of his fingers. He could have vexed them or done anything he could, but he didn't, and there's a reason he did it, and it was for our salvation, because he wants to bring us to his Father, and the only way it could happen was for him to endure the unspeakable and exquisite agony of the cross. So if there was a cross in his life, there's to be a cross in ours. We have no right reason or righteous expectation to expect otherwise if we want to call ourselves his disciples. So these are lofty, exalted standards, and no man can follow them, but he did provide the perfect model. That is not to suggest we should not try and follow them, because eventually everyone's got a breaking point with how much they can endure, but he did not have a breaking point. And his example is ever before us and above us. Romans 12:14 through 15. Paul reflects much of what we earlier heard. Blessed those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. So he's calling them to have a complete egalitarian empathy to whoever in the world is rejoicing at this moment in time, and whoever is crying. And the sad fact is a lot more people are crying. So, the price we pay when becoming Christians is we kind of enter into the sufferings of the world, and we endure it for their sakes, and it spits us right back out. Nevertheless, that is the path we have chosen to sign up for. But, most people, hate to say it, don't want to pay the price. 2 Corinthians 12:10. 12:10. Therefore I take pleasures in weakness, in insults, in needs, in persecutions, in distress, for the sake of Messiah. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So Paul is flipping upside down the paradox of strength and weakness as traditionally understood. When he is weak, he had a thorn in his flesh. We don't know what it was, but it was whatever it was a debilitating physical ailment that prevented him from going as far as he would like or as fast as he could to get there. But it was given to him to remind him of the power of his grace, and he accepts the revelation with that in mind. He counts it occasion to rejoice and to have pleasure when you're being insulted and persecuted and distressed and suffering in any way, shape, or form. For the sake he was caused. And that we're going to read James 1:2-4. This is the brother of the Messiah, the biological half-brother. My brothers, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. So James has the same mindset. He wants to take pleasure and rejoice in the occasion that one's faith is tested, because through that process the faith may grow and enhance and perfect and become all it was meant to be. And without the testing of that faith, the faith could never grow, because unless it's challenged, we're not going to exercise the faith. So as we mentioned earlier, it's not an either or. It's a believe and suffer. Knowing that the proving of your faith works endurance. So this is one of the qualities that gets molded in the furnace of affliction. The endurance which is the ability to pay the price and go the extra mile and then some. Because what does the Master say in the Sermon on the Mount when a Roman soldier commands you to carry his luggage 1 mile, take it 2? And let endurance have a perfect work, so that you be perfect and complete, lacking in naught. So by the endurance which is molded through persecution, we may have everything we need, because whenever we abase or abound, we are rejoicing for the Master and knowing that he enters into our pains, and we are partakers of the fellowship of suffering, and thereby advancing the good news. Because a lot of the stuff which passes as Christianity today isn't Christianity. So the prosperity gospel heretics, you will never find them talking about pain or suffering or hell or sin or end times revelation. It's a really distorted depiction of what Christianity is. But I just want to make time to close 1 Corinthians 4:12 rather. And labor working with our own hands. Being cursed, we bless. Being persecuted, we suffer. This is the Paul explaining the laundry list of some of the things he went through for the gospel's sake, for the spread and the sake of his calling and just fulfilling his mission. But the things that are relevant to our intended emphasis is cursing or blessing when one is cursed indiscriminately, and just bearing the persecution and suffering from it, but ultimately embracing the suffering for the growth and the salvation of not only yourself but others. Final passage we're going to close on today is Romans 8:18 is the first one. So, for I reckon that the suffering of the present time are not worth comparing with the esteem that is to be revealed in us. In other words, it is all worth what we are going through right now, no matter how grievous, no matter how ailing, no matter how agonizing, no matter how painful, is all worth it, because it is the price we pay to gain eternal salvation through the Master who suffered for us. And the esteem that is going to be revealed in us is the resurrected expectation in our heavenly homeland. And final 2 verses, 24 and 25. For in this hope we were saved, but hope that is not seen is not hope. For when anyone sees, what does he hope? So we can't see the heavens. We have only vague allusions to, and mostly in the forms of like and as, because when the apostles, when John especially was given the vision of the end times and the new heaven and new Jerusalem, it was he had to describe it as like, because there was literally nothing that could be seen and compared to it. And if we hope, what do we not see? We eagerly await for it with endurance. So even while we are enduring the price of pain for the sake of the spread of the good news, we are all the while and at the same time eagerly expecting it, and with endurance. So there is an endurance to the promise, and there is an endurance to the path to the promise. But if we endure with the path to the promise, then we can endure with the promise, which is eternal life without end, and that will be something beyond endurance. So I hope that's the reason you're here. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to see you. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.